Welcome back to Policy Exchange. My name's Dean Godson, I'm Director. Look forward to most important discussion with two of the most consequential figures in the debate on the Ukraine conflict in Europe today. Obviously, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, been a great friend to us through the years, former Commander US Army Europe, and of course been massively far-sighted long before the present latest conflict blew up in Ukraine about what Western alliance needed to do to shore up the position of Ukraine, and so many of his prophecies and recommendations have been vindicated all too tragically in recent times, and also great privilege to be able to welcome back Right Honourable Lord Robertson of Port Ellen, of course former UK Secretary of Defence and Secretary General of NATO, been my privilege to know for the longest period, and both of them together will be addressing the subject of Ukraine. Have we missed the strategic moment? They'll be doing in conversation with each other and then handing over to questions from the floor, usual House rules here at Policy Exchange. No question too outrageous. You simply have to state your name and organisation first. So, Lord Robertson, over to you. I know you'll be kicking off, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Dean. And it's sort of slightly unusual to have a conversation, which I think is going to be one-sided, because the guest of honour here is Ben Hodges, who I hope is going to enlighten us from the military point of view about what is going on in this miserable conflict, unnecessary conflict in Ukraine today. So his background in Europe is after my time. I was in NATO at the time when Vladimir Putin was a friend, told jokes, sat round the table at the NATO-Russia Council with me as chairman of it, cracked a joke at the end about NATO headquarters should be called the House of Councils, since I chaired so many councils, and those who know Russian will know that the Russian word for councils is Soviets, which came as a bit of a surprise to the Polish delegation that day, but there was good humour in the air, but things degenerated after that, and Ben was in charge of the US Army in Europe at a much less convivial time as well. So, but then you are becoming controversial at the present moment by being very bold about what the Ukrainians are doing and what the Ukrainians should do, and basically what their objectives should be as well. And there are people who say that you are being too optimistic, too bold. My first question to you is, can the Ukrainians win against Russia? And if so, how are they going to do it?
I am an optimist. I admit that, but I've never seen anything significant that was accomplished by a room full of pessimists. We're at war, and war is a test of will, and it's a test of logistics. And clearly the Ukrainians have the superior will. They're defending their country. I don't think you could fill up this room with Russian soldiers that actually want to be in Ukraine. So when I think about the state of the war now, this Russo-Ukrainian war, after really 9 years, but about a year and a half since the war, the Russians escalated this into a full-scale invasion. After all of that, Russia controls only about 16% of Ukraine. They have still not achieved air superiority despite having huge advantage in numbers. They have not destroyed a single train or convoy bringing equipment or ammunition from Poland into Ukraine, although there's no mystery about where the railroads are and where the highways are. The Black Sea Fleet goes nowhere near the Ukrainian coast. They are terrified of getting anywhere too close to Ukraine, and Ukraine doesn't even have a navy. The Russian leadership, they hate each other. Kadyrov, Prigozhin, Shoigu, Gerasimov, they absolutely hate each other. And that will trickle down, of course, to the generals and colonels below all of them. So you don't have any sort of coherence in their defense. Their only hope is to hope that we lose will to continue supporting Ukraine. On the other hand, 50 nations are supporting Ukraine. 50 nations. And I mean, who would have thought 2 weeks ago that Germany would offer another €3 billion package, or that UK would agree to provide Storm Shadow? These are the kind of things that give me such optimism, on top of the performance of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian women and men in their armed forces and in their population.
And yet, there are people who say that Ben Hodges is still being over-optimistic in saying that they can and should take back all of the territory, the sovereign territory of Ukraine, including Crimea. Do you still hold to that view?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, I always put this gigantic caveat next to it, that assuming that we continue to provide everything that we said we would and that they need. That really includes, of course, long-range precision weapons, which are needed to make Crimea untenable. If the Ukrainians had ATACMS today with its 300-kilometer range, it's exactly 300 kilometers from Odessa to Sevastopol, the Black Sea Fleet would have already had to leave. The commander of the Black Sea Fleet, I can imagine now, his sweating when he heard that Storm Shadow was coming. I mean, because now his logistics facilities there at Sevastopol are going to be hit. I mean, and he can't sit there in that port. They're going to have to reposition to Novorossiysk. This will make it much more difficult for them to keep launching precision weapons at Ukrainian apartment buildings, which is pretty much what the Navy does now. I will say this, and I know that my position is a minority position. I accept that. The only mistake, the only criticism I would have of my president, who has done a very good job of helping unify not only our alliance, but the 50 nations in supporting Ukraine, is that he stops short of saying what the desired end state is. I mean, that's the number one job for the civilian leader, I think, is to declare our strategic outcome that we want is this. And we didn't have that clear for us 19 years in Afghanistan, and you see how that ended. So getting the strategic objective clearly defined is important. And my president also stopped short of saying, we want Ukraine to win. If he says that, then all the excuses about how much fuel an M1 tank uses or how long it takes to train an F-16 pilot or whatever, all those excuses fall away and we deliver what's needed. I think the Russians are so vulnerable right now. They're fragile. If we were to provide those capabilities, this whole thing could be over by the end of the year. For sure, Crimea, which is the decisive terrain, could be liberated by the end of August.
So why are you in a minority? You're leaving aside the president for the moment. Why is it that the other armchair generals, of whom there are a large number, some of them in the room probably here as well, there's at least one armchair admiral at least in the audience. So why do you think that you're in a minority?
Besides the fact that they're all wrong, look, I acknowledge that I am optimistic, but it is because I spent a lot of time around Ukrainian soldiers starting in 2015. I pay attention to what they do and how the Russians do not have a culture that enables them to make rapid adjustments, and they don't have a culture that unleashes the talent of their young people. I mean, it is still the Tsar's army. It's still the Tsar's army. The Ukrainians intercept radio messages and phone calls all the time where Ukrainian or Russian officers are saying, if you pull back, you're going to be shot. If your soldiers run away, they're going to be shot. I mean, this is like 1942 stuff. That's happening now. And when I think about the mythology of the Russians can outsuffer anybody, that's not true. I mean, in World War II they could, but that was the Soviet Union. And most of the people that were suffering were Ukrainians and Belarusians. So last fall, when the Kremlin announced the partial mobilization, 500,000 Russian military-age males left the country. rather than be mobilized. That doesn't sound like somebody that's ready to outsuffer anybody else and that really, really cares about Ukraine. So I think the further away you are from Ukraine, the more susceptible you are to believing in the mythology, like, come on, how are they going to defeat Russia? Or I even hear this in Germany sometimes from super well-educated people, come on, man, Crimea was always Russia. I thought, sir, that would be quite a surprise for the Crimean Tatars, the Ottomans, and everybody else that was there, even the Lithuanians, before Catherine the Great took it. Ambassador.
So, well, I'm one of the few people, I suppose, certainly in the room, who's been to Sevastopol, and a pretty miserable experience it was. It was Ukrainian at the time, but Sevastopol was a closed city during Soviet times. So the level of intermarriage was very considerable indeed. It had to be because people couldn't sort of intermix. So huge social problems were involved. They also disposed of old warships by simply pulling the plug out. So the main site that we saw as we drove to the Ukrainian flagship was a lot of rusty hulks in the water. But that was when it was under Ukrainian control. So you think that that simply the threat of the long-range missiles would be enough to get the commanders in Crimea to pull back?
Well, not just the threat. I mean, there's going to need to be some serious explosions happening dockside in Sevastopol for them to be convinced, to realize that they cannot stop very sophisticated, complex attacks from drones, from Storm Shadow or ATACMS, from maritime unmanned systems, that the Ukrainians, when this is all over, I think we're going to go like, holy hell, how did we miss that? I mean, the Ukrainians are going to do things that we never even thought of. That they've been doing that now for the past 16 months. They are very clever, but again, as I think if you're in here, you know exactly who Napoleon is, and he said the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. That the psychological, moral component of warfare is so much more important than just the physical, the equipment. And when I think about how the adaptive and creative and innovative Ukrainian soldiers are, compared to what we see coming from the other side, where it is just pushing untrained conscripts and former prisoners into the meat grinder, this is another reason why I am so optimistic. The Ukrainians have surprised us over and over with how quickly they were able to adapt to new equipment. I mean, time after time after time. Now, I think I listened to General Zaluzhny the other day. Excellent interview on YouTube that he did. It was a Ukrainian interview, but fortunately with English subtitles. And he still respects the Russians. He says they're tough, they're clever. So there's no hubris on his part. But I think that the Ukrainian General Staff has impressed me with how clever they are, how well they understand the operational level of war, and also how disciplined they are. We know so much more about the Russians than we do about Ukrainians. I could not tell you with any confidence how many Ukrainian armor brigades there are. I see numbers out there, but I really don't know. I suspect they have a lot more than we think they do.
So if the Russian tactic is, because they're not advancing, they're digging in, they're digging trenches, laying minefields, building concrete, and waiting us out. Waiting probably for the next presidential election in America, or waiting for the Europeans to sort of start calling for a ceasefire. Is that a tactic that could work?
It could. It could work. The Ukrainians are not going to sit around and wait on us. I think they see how close they are that they can actually accomplish everything that President Zelensky laid out as winning, which is 1991 borders. But of course, it will be a lot more costly and difficult without support of the West. So I think that the Kremlin's only hope is that we lose the will to continue supporting. Fortunately, at least in the United States, there's still very strong bipartisan support. Stand fast, you've got some very loud extremists on both sides, but the vast majority of the Congress strongly supports this. You see Ukrainian flags all over the United States, to include in the heart of Trump country. And our election is still about 18 months away. That's a lifetime in American politics. And so I feel confident that we're going to see this out. And I just wish that the president would say, let's get this done.
Yeah, but the president and other people, other folk in the White House, I think are apprehensive about escalation and going too far and stimulating World War III, a confrontation between Russia and NATO generally. And that is an inhibition, and it exists in other European capitals as well. Do you, how do you counter that?
Well, of course, I have zero responsibility. I'm a retired general officer. I have zero responsibility. The president...
Well, neither of us have. Both the liberty of...
The president has the weight of the world on his shoulders, and so he cannot afford to be as cavalier as maybe I sound sometimes. I respect that. But you know, the Russians have already escalated. They escalated in February of last year because they saw that after 8 years following their first invasion, we didn't do anything. I mean, we really didn't. The height of American strategic argument was about, you know, Hunter Biden's laptop and Giuliani and this nonsense and whether or not to give javelins. I mean, that was it. And the whole Minsk process, Germany and France were not going to do anything. Germany was still building Nord Stream 2. We were a mess coming out of Afghanistan, the whole January 6th catastrophe. So the Russians were pretty sure we were not going to do anything. So in other words, this whole war now is what failed deterrence looks like. We didn't do anything after Georgia. We didn't do anything when they supported the Assad regime with the chemical weapons in Syria, despite an Obama red line. And so here we are. In other words, they escalate when they see that we are weak, that we're not going to do anything. It's the opposite when we do stuff. They have been threatening every time the United States or the UK said we're going to provide this. And they do nothing because they can't. Yes, they do have thousands of nuclear weapons. And I'm sure that this is the main thing that concerns the president. And yes, the Russian leadership doesn't care anything about how many innocent people are killed. They've demonstrated that. But there are zero positive outcomes for Russia if they use a nuclear weapon. And I think they actually know that. My president has told them there will be catastrophic consequences if they use any nuclear weapon. President Xi has told them, do not do this. Prime Minister Modi has said, do not do this. I think the Russian General Staff understands that Ukrainians will keep coming even after Russia were to use a nuclear weapon. So if we use it and they still keep coming, then what? But every time my president says, no World War III, that's oxygen to the Kremlin. That tells them all they need to do about once a week, trot out some idiot to say, we're going to use a nuclear weapon against London. And everybody's like, oh, hell, they might do it. You remember when they announced they were going to send a tactical nuclear weapon to Belarus? I mean, people are like, oh my God, that did zero to improve the capability of that tactical nuclear weapon because it didn't have to go to Belarus to be used. But it was just another way to remind us we have nuclear weapons.
Well, it's nuclear blackmail.
Exactly. And
that followed a joint statement by Lukashenko and Putin days before saying that nuclear weapons should not be located in other countries.
So another way to look at it is their nuclear weapons are really only effective if they don't use them because they see that we continue to deter ourselves. This is bad news for us if the United States and UK can be deterred from acting just because Russia threatens the use of a tactical nuclear weapon. I mean, if that's the case, then everybody that's close to getting a nuclear weapon or wants one, they are going to double down on their efforts to get that because they see how effective it can be. So this is an important part of, I think, changing the threat by demonstrating to the Russians we're not going to be deterred by this.
Yeah. So let us say that your prophecy comes true and that the Ukrainians prevail.
With caveats.
Well, yeah, with the caveats. But what I would like you to do is to speculate as to what Russia is going to be like if they are defeated in the in Ukraine? What kind of Russia will there be, and what threat would that then possibly pose to the West?
I think this is the other reason that the White House is so hesitant, not only because they're concerned about a nuclear escalation, understandably, but also we're not sure what Russia looks like after Ukraine wins. I mean, what if this is what if there is a collapse? And I think China also is signaling we do not want a collapse of the Russian Federation. Not that because they're in love with the Kremlin, but it's bad for business, and they don't want to see all the outcomes. And I think that the administration is not really sure. You can't contain it, you can't control it. Well, what will happen? And so I think there is some anxiety there, and certainly in a lot of European capitals, I would imagine. But you know better than me, Lord Robertson, that Russia has been an empire for about 5 centuries. It's never been a state. They've never had a reckoning with who they are. And I think until they are defeated, I mean crushed in the old-fashioned way, there'll be another Putin after this one. I mean, there's never going to be somebody that is able to grip the reins there and actually change how Russia is. And so I think for all of us long term, there needs to be that sort of a reckoning. War crimes, all of that. I have no illusion that somehow Russia is going to blossom into a democratic society like former Soviet republics have, or former Warsaw Pact countries have. But nonetheless, there needs to be some sort of a reckoning. I think there are probably about 85 oblasts, republics, territories, entities that make up the Russian Federation. I would guess that at least a third of them have long been waiting for a chance to break away if they could be survivable somehow on their own. Chechnya being first among them. I think Mr. Kadyrov, even though he's on TikTok all the time, you never see video of dead Chechen soldiers. I think he has managed to keep them out of the meat grinder, either so he can be the savior or they break away. Obviously, there's a real danger with lots of nuclear weapons being out there. The Iranians, I'm sure, would love to get their hands on those. People will be worried about the power, energy infrastructure. I think that the Chinese are looking closely at some old maps, thinking about what used to be.
But shouldn't we be worried?
Yes.
About a Russia that is crushed and is defeated, and yet is still in possession of 1,000 nuclear weapons? I remember Mr. Primakov. I met Mr. Primakov, who was Yeltsin's last prime minister, who said, that Putin coming to power was going to produce a degree of stability in Russia, because of Russia, that it was out of control and yet in possession of all these nuclear weapons, including Ukraine's form of nuclear weapons, is a major danger to the world.
Well, those are fair points, and I think that what I hope is happening is that London and Paris and Berlin and Washington and other capitals are communicating to all of these sort of the elites and different people in Russia, saying, look, there's going to be something after this happens. We're going to help Ukraine win. And Ukraine is going to become a member of NATO. Ukraine is going to become a member of the European Union, should they want, and should those institutions decide that they want that. But this doesn't mean disaster. It doesn't have to mean disaster for Russia. What do Russians want Russia to look like after this is said and done? Whoever comes after Putin, and if I may, last night you said this, there's no way whoever comes after him could be any worse. Yeah. I agree with that completely. And whoever does come after him will also be weaker, because he or she will inherit a military that is in tatters, a defense industry that's been shattered, their ability to influence the world with energy is gone. So the next person will have a weaker hand, and priority one for that person will probably be to consolidate their power not continue attacks against Ukraine. And I think we should be communicating with these guys about, okay, how do we get to some sort of a post-conflict situation where Russia can rebuild its economy and start, fall in love with their own borders instead of everybody else's.
Yeah, well, I wrote a speech last year I gave at St Anthony's College in Oxford, saying that we needed to offer a prospect for the post-Putin Russians.
That's a
the
better way to say
younger
it.
generation have got to know that he's the pariah, not the state, not the people themselves. And I watched the 2-hour tirade that he delivered to the Duma and State Council recently, and I knew some of the people in the audience, a very inanimate audience, totally inanimate audience. And a lot of these people have got houses in London, children at English public schools, homes in the south of France and in the Hamptons and in America. They've grown used to that, and they're listening to this drivel, coming out, a stream of consciousness, 2 hours long of bowdlerized history as well. So I think that we need to give that prospect. But the guy sitting in the Kremlin, the prospect he's looking at is that in 18 months' time, Donald Trump might be the president of the United States again. You think that's a prospect that fills him with hope?
I'm sure that's his dream scenario. And the fact that that's even a possibility also is it's embarrassing for me to have to admit that even though I think our former president is, I can't believe it, but what's more concerning is that there are 20, 30 million Americans that would want that. That's more concerning to me. Having said that, I think that we should not be afraid of winning, number one. Number two, that your prime minister, my president, and other Western leaders should be talking about what does a post-conflict Russia look like. I mean, we were not reluctant to talk about Germany that way, or Japan. I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about that, and it turned out pretty doggone well. So why not plan for success? Why not start reaching out and communicating this? My sense, actually, I mean, this has gone so bad for Russia. They have lost so many people. The Russians that you just sort of alluded to, which you just alluded, have lost so much. I mean, their once great life is gone. It may never come back for them unless there is a change on the other side. Now, I do want to be very, very clear. America has a bad record, a bad track record when it comes to regime change. I mean, we don't do it very well. So I'm absolutely not advocating that. But what I am advocating is that we should think about that possibility and be prepared for it and envision what does that look like. And then the Russians, this is up to them on, is their life actually better having Vladimir Putin? I think my sense is that he actually has less and less power to do stuff now than a year ago, or what we imagined. I think there are people that are starting to kind of, or the circle is closing in around him a little bit. I mean, the fact that Prigozhin says what he does publicly, the ineptitude of people from the general staff of how they're doing this, I think that we won't know until after it happens. I think Putin's control is a lot less than maybe what I thought it was a year ago.
Yeah, I once met Shoigu, the defense minister, when he was minister for emergencies, and he gave me a gift as I left the meeting, and I'm not sure whether it was symbolic, but it was an ice pick, which now hangs in my garden gazebo. But it may have been symbolic. So let me ask one more question before we invite the audience to ask you questions as well. Ukraine and NATO. The Vilnius summit is coming up in July. Do you think a country at war. Ukraine should be offered NATO membership now?
Absolutely. First of all, they're the best army in Europe. Well, the best army in Europe, Ukrainian army. The alliance is finally waking up, I think. Certainly the United States is finally waking up to the strategic importance of the Black Sea region. Ukraine is not an island. It matters to us not because we love the people, but because of where it sits on the map. And if we think strategically about the Black Sea region, we'll be a lot more clever in our interactions with our Turkish ally. We'll think differently about the Republic of Georgia, and then the critical role of Ukraine, as well as our Romanian and Bulgarian allies. So having a strategic view of that region in all domains, diplomacy, information, and economy, not just military, I think would lead us to the conclusion that we need Ukraine inside the alliance to have a good strategy for the Black Sea region. Secondly, if I wouldn't expect membership to be offered in Vilnius, and unfortunately, I don't even think we're going to hear a clear declaration of membership action plan in Vilnius. But it's something that is more tangible than saying we hope one day. I mean, there needs to be something tangible to keep to begin to build this. Now, I think the United States has a huge responsibility here to shepherd this process, which means we have to fix our bilateral relationship with Ukraine. I mean, billions of dollars of stuff is going to Ukraine, but we don't have a normal relationship. I mean, we've got to get a normal bilateral relationship and demonstrate that we're going to help in every facet of Ukraine's rebuilding, their continued orientation towards the West and democratic principles, to work closely with the European Union and the UK on helping Ukraine develop into a full, strong, confident, liberal democratic country. And then I think then we'll be in a place where their membership becomes not only feasible, but absolutely desired by every other member. That won't happen as long as Russia occupies Crimea. And Crimea is like a dagger into the belly of Ukraine. Ukraine will never be able to rebuild their economy as long as Russian forces occupy Crimea and block access to all the ports.
You seem to be saying two different things. They should be offered the membership action plan, which is the conveyor belt towards membership. But you're also saying that you can't have Ukraine in if its territory is occupied by the Russians.
So what I'm saying, what you just described is what I said. I just means I said it poorly. What I'm trying to say, we have got to help Ukraine win, to include getting Crimea, so that they can be on this on track to become a member of the alliance. I think it's not good strategic thinking or helpful to say there's no way they can join as long as Russia still occupies or they're still at war. I mean, that gives some countries an easy out, rather than thinking strategically about what do we want? How do we protect Europe? How do we protect all of Europe from Russian aggression or Iranian attacks or any other threats that are out there? And I think that means you have to think strategically about the greater Black Sea region. And that means Ukraine as a member of the alliance.
Okay, right. Lots of food for thought in that exchange. So Dean is going to take over the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you both for outstanding presentation. I know plenty of questions. Just gentleman at the front, if you say your name and organisation, yes, please. We just wait till the microphone comes up so we can hear you. Just.
Of Lithuania. So thank you very much for this opportunity to come here to listen to two men which I both respect. Lord Robertson, you know that during your time Lithuania and 10 other countries were invited to join alliance. So you still hold high respect in Lithuania, and was General Ben, of course. Whenever you speak, we listen in Vilnius and very much agree to 100%. And very much agree what you were saying about Russia, which definitely we are so much hesitant to speak about the defeat of Russia. And this is exactly how we see future of Russia. Russia which would overcome via defeat and via reconciliation with the past and with the post-imperial syndrome. Only then Russia can move into what we might expect to see future Russia as democratic, accountable, transparent. But my question is probably both of you, which actually already started, but I would dig deeper on Vilnius summit deliverables. This is exactly what I, as ambassador here, tried to promote. So one is the issue of Ukrainian NATO membership. And of course, it's clear that membership in Vilnius is not feasible, but at least Vilnius can open the path toward membership. Inviting Zelensky to Vilnius and then yet to say NATO door is open is too little for the country. But also putting NATO membership with a caveat that only when all territories are liberated, also a little bit strange, because then you give argument to Russia to keep these territories. So what Vilnius can offer Ukraine substantially as a path towards NATO. And the second issue, which also not controversial, but still from our perspective crucially important, is the Madrid summit last year made clear that when it is required, NATO will strengthen eastern flank of NATO. So when we now compare Madrid from today until Vilnius summit, we see that this when is already here, because Russia is still continuing the war. Russia is threatening Baltic countries and other eastern allies, and there are no substantial increase of NATO forces in the Baltics, in other countries. So how you would see, General, the need of NATO, more NATO boots on the ground in case of the strengthening NATO's eastern flank?
Can I defer first to you, sir? Because I think you could address some of those things from your experience as former Secretary General also, and then I will.
Well, I'm not sure what. It's a political decision that will have to be made if Zelensky comes to Vilnius about membership. It's a country at war. The test for NATO membership is there. It's good neighbourly relations, sorting out your internal forces. So we'll see how they progress towards that. But on the second question, I'm interested because I don't actually think that NATO membership is what bothers Vladimir Putin. If we remember back, this whole crisis started when the European Union offered association agreement to President Yanukovych of Ukraine.
In Vilnius.
In Vilnius. He rejected it. I had a phone call from the Kremlin. The Maidan followed it. The whole issue sort of created. So, and at the moment, NATO isn't the big problem for Russia. If it was, why would they have taken all the troops from the NATO-facing countries, right from Finland right down to the Baltics and the rest? They're all fighting in the Donbass. They've taken them in from the Far East. So in a way it gives away the fact that actually a country that has got nuclear weapons is not going to worry about NATO. It has to worry about the democratization that the European Union created, and having a democratic, mixed economy, pluralist country on the borders of Russia was a serious challenge to the Putin model of authoritarianism as well. So I think we've got to see it in that context. And although you might reinforce in the future the forces, I think Vladimir Putin has illustrated very clearly that NATO membership is not a major threat to Russia.
So I would agree with everything I just heard. As far as the Vilnius summit, obviously I hope that Turkey will by that time have decided that yes, of course we want Sweden to be in the alliance, and Hungary will stop hiding behind Turkey, and that they'll also get out of the way. And so that would really be a great achievement at Vilnius to see Sweden welcomed into the alliance. I think it's possible, but each nation has their own agenda, and we'll know more from Turkey after the 28th. And I thought the Swedish defense minister yesterday was very, he said, look, Turkey, they have election, they have sovereign decisions, and I thought he handled that question very well. The second thing, of course, unless there's something solid, concrete, for Ukraine coming out of Vilnius. I think the Vilnius summit will be judged not a failure, but a absolute missed opportunity. That we will have faltered in the face of Russian intimidation. I think that's how the world will sort of see it. That's how the Russians will see it. And so I think there has to be something concrete. Still, to get 31 nations to agree is always a challenge, especially on really big, hard, important things. I imagine that the NATO Secretary General is going to come up with something that feels like Membership Action Plan, has a lot of the manifestations of Membership Action Plan. It just won't be called that. Maybe elevating up to a NATO Ukraine Council instead of Commission, things like that. So I am optimistic about that. But then to your second question, at Vilnius, I hope, and I know that Angus Lapsley has been doing huge work to increase awareness and focus on logistics for the alliance. Because it doesn't matter how many tanks you have or jets you have or submarines you have if you don't have the logistics necessary to enable all of that and to enable the Supreme Allied Commander's area of responsibility. So I think we're going to see something that emphasizes forward positioning of ammunition, pushing further forward the NATO various fuel infrastructures, improving military mobility so that NATO forces can move as faster than Russian forces to critical places such as the Suwalki corridor or the Focșani gates in Romania. And then I hope that there will be conversation about the need for improved integrated air and missile defense. I mean, now that the Russians have demonstrated that they will use multi-million-dollar precision weapons against apartment buildings, you know, our requirement is no longer just protecting airports and seaports. It's now 500 million European civilians that have to be protected. So that's a big change in the requirement. Ambassador, you know, I've known you for many years, and you know how much I love Lithuania and how impressed I am with the soldiers of Lithuania. I mean, they're first class. But I think it is unhelpful that Lithuanian leadership continues to criticize Germany for not delivering a brigade. I don't think that was actually the commitment that a German brigade would come live in Lithuania. First of all, having a garrison there does not improve security. Until you have training areas where that entire brigade can maintain a level of readiness, it's actually worse than them not being there. I mean, and the Russians will be able to see it's just a bunch of soldiers sitting in barracks. That's not a deterrent. So I would never want to send American soldiers there unless they were able to constantly train. And of course, you know, we keep an armored battalion there on top of the German-led Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group that is integrated into the great Iron Wolf Brigade. Germany has a brigade, and I'm not spokesman for the Bundeswehr or the German Ministry of Defense, just to be clear. But I do pay attention to this because it's in such a critical area. They do have a brigade that's dedicated and that they train and prepare to move there quickly. That'll never be satisfactory, I think, probably for all the Lithuanian leadership. But I disagree that somehow Germany has not lived up to an obligation. I would ask, has Lithuania done everything it should do? I'm not picking on Lithuania, but you've posed this important question. I know for a fact that Lithuania has over 100,000 former soldiers who are on the reserve list. They've never been called up. They're not allocated against any unit. So you've got let's just say that number is exaggerated. Let's say there's 60,000. That's about 12 brigades right there that are of Lithuanians that live there that are not trained, ready, allocated against units to prepare. So in the meanwhile, while we wait for the improvement of training areas and the capacity to take on more, has Lithuania done everything it can possibly do to defend itself? I would say our three Baltic allies. Why does each nation have separate equipment? I mean, are there things that we could be doing that would improve the effectiveness? And then finally, our Danish allies, you know, they've offered the division headquarters there. About 85 people, most of whom are sitting in Copenhagen. So that's not a legitimate division headquarters. I think there's got to be another solution. Things that could be done versus just adding more troops from other countries up there. That would be, and fix Rail Baltica. I mean, this rail project, which would put all three Baltic countries on European gauge railroad, which would facilitate movement, has taken as long as, I mean, pick your worst construction project in America. It took about 12 years to finish the mixing bowl there in Springfield, that all of you, with which most of you are familiar. Let's fix that too, if I may.
So, thank you. I see, because time's limited, maybe take the next few questions just as a clutch. Do we have anyone here with the microphone? Who's here? Yep, gentleman there, and then lady behind. Perhaps the lady first. There. Name and organisation, please.
Thank you very much. Simona Leskor, Ambassador of Slovenia. Another member state joining NATO during Lord Robertson chairmanship. If you would allow me, I would slightly change the geographic and ask you, both of you actually, what's your view on the role of China in ending this illegal invasion or war in, or if there's any role for China? And then just a very brief other question. There is another part of Europe that is that Russia is destabilizing, and it's called Western Balkans. So how much attention we need to pay there, or why we don't pay the attention there? Thank you.
Gentleman in front there. Next. Name and organisation, please.
Hugh Trenchard, House of Lords. General, I entirely agree with what you have said. And my observation would be that there's a majority of people who support, both in the UK and in European countries, who want to support us in achieving success for Zelensky and for Ukraine. But if you ask them, does that include taking back Crimea? I don't think there is a majority of people who support, because there is a misconception, which is widely believed, that Crimea has always been Russian. And I don't think anybody has been very effective in denying that, although the Lithuanian ambassador told me that they don't see Crimea. But we, British, think, and most people think, that Crimea has actually always been Russian, and that had there been a referendum pre-2014, both in Crimea and perhaps in eastern Donbass, that a majority would have voted to be part of Russia. So how are we going to get over that? The objective and what constitutes winning is not clearly defined in a way that there's a consensus among the people. And secondly, who's going to pay for the rebuilding of Ukraine, and how much will it cost?
One final question at the back. I see a gentleman there at the back. Name and organisation, please.
John Speller, Labour Member of Parliament, previous Defence Minister and currently Vice Chairman of the Commons Defence Committee. In response to the Lithuanian ambassador, you touched on the issue about logistics, the all-important crucial area of logistics. But even to move munitions, you actually have to have manufactured them in the first place. And isn't one of the crucial weaknesses that this conflict has revealed is our ability to resupply, either from stocks or indeed from having a sufficient industrial base, and all countries are wrestling with this. Given that in desktop exercises of a possible Russian invasion of Europe revealed how quickly we would run out of munitions, was it a policy failure of the military or defence departments or relations with defence companies that we are so ill-prepared? And is there sufficient urgency in order to remedy that situation, not only to supply Ukraine, but also to enable us to be credible in response to any wider Russian activity?
You really attract a crowd here. These are. Do you want to take any of that first?
No, I'll come in after you.
Okay, to clean up. First of all, I love all three of the questions. the industrial base. I mean, these are not charities. They have thousands of employees, complicated supply chains. Whether we're talking about artillery ammunition or storm shadow, sophisticated weapons, and so industry is not going to make a whole lot of these things and then hope that some government is interested in buying it. There has to be a demand. There has to be a requirement, and so finally. The alliance now is at the point where you've got really good, strong, approved regional plans. And the plan for how you defend a region is what drives the requirement. And it was what drives training. So now with plans, you can figure out what are the requirements. And then those requirements have to go from the various ministries, the ministers of defense or Department of Defense of the various member countries to industry. The United States, a year ago, was producing about 8,000 rounds of artillery ammunition per month because that was what the demand signal was. That's how much we use per month for training, 8,000. In a year, it's already up to 25,000 rounds per month. So, and that was based on a demand signal from the Department of Defense, and a demand signal means money, and then industry always can respond to that. So we've been wringing our hands for quite some time about, oh my God, they're using so much ammunition over there, we got to pick it up. Until somebody hands money to the industry to actually do it, it's not going to happen. I think it will happen much faster than we might think it does as soon as we demonstrate the political will by investing the resources. But yes, we all failed to anticipate how much would be required. I mean, air defense weapons, artillery, rockets. There's one little factory in Arkansas that makes the GMLRS rocket that flies off of a HIMARS or the Hellfire, one place. And so we have to increase the demand. But it's a critical question. And I think the Chinese are paying attention to what we are giving up, how fast we can produce more. And China's role here, when China offered their amazing 14-point peace plan, which was hardly a peace plan, but they offered it up. I loved it that Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, said, we have a peace plan. It's called the UN Charter. And I thought that was a fantastic response from her part. So, yes, China is going to play a role here. I think the most important role that we should be thinking about is how do we deter China from making the same terrible miscalculation in the Indo-Pacific region that Russia has made against Ukraine. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is what failed deterrence looks like. And so I think the Chinese are watching, are we really serious about defending the so-called international rules-based order? Freedom of navigation, respect for sovereign borders, respect for human rights, respect for international organizations and international law. If we're not willing to do it in Europe, where frankly the problem is much simpler than it would be in the Indo-Pacific region, then I don't think the Chinese are terribly impressed with anything that we say about Taiwan or South China Sea. Yet, all of us, including the United States, want access to Chinese markets. All of us depend on stuff that comes from China. For me, the best way to make sure that China remains a responsible member of the international community is that the U.S., the UK, our allies in the Indo-Pacific region, and the European Union combine our incredible economic power, diplomatic power together to hold China accountable to those values we say we care about. Make them live up to the agreements to which they are a signatory about trade, about respect for technology that belongs to other people, those kind of things. Much easier for me to say, but I think that's got to be the approach. It's not just about can the U.S. get more ships out into the Indo-Pacific region, but it's really working with allies and partners in the economic and diplomatic domain. That's how we deter China, I believe. Lord Trencher, your comment about Crimea. Walking here this morning, of course, I walked by the wonderful Crimean War memorial that's right there, and I'm sure every Londoner or visitor walks past that like, oh yeah, Crimea, the big Russian place that where we won. I mean, that's probably in everybody's memory of Crimea, and the Russians have done a good job on capturing narratives, and they've got a lot of willing listeners in places like here but also in Washington and down in Bavaria and Italy, people that are willing to buy into that, to accept that somehow it was, I mean, even President Steinmeier, a couple of years ago, he said, you know, we have to support Nord Stream 2 because, well, we have a debt to the 30 million Russians that we killed. Well, that is about so far from being accurate, but that's the federal president of Germany that had bought into this narrative. And so part of the reason I jumped on Dean's invitation to come here today is because even more important than winning on the battlefield is winning in the information domain. And we have to compete in the information domain to push back on false narratives about, you know, well, this was always this. I mean, my Lithuanian friends say, well, actually, this was always a Lithuanian empire, you know, and I've seen the map. And so I think that what matters is not who owned it 4 centuries ago, but what does the law say now? And Russia signed at least 4 different documents which acknowledge that Crimea is part of Ukraine. So whether or not they can, Putin brings out a map from 17 whenever, which he did the other day, which someone quickly pointed out that, you know, most of what he claims is Russia was somebody else's territory on that same map. But nonetheless, what matters is, do we have respect for the international rules-based order? Now, I'm sure everyone in this room is saying, U.S., well done. You guys kind of pick and choose as well. Maybe so. Our credibility is hurt when we don't live up to our own talking points as well.
Brilliant. Thank you. Last word, Lord Robertson.
Just on that particular point about Crimea and indeed the Donbass, Putin sort of makes out that Gorbachev was tricked after the end of the Cold War, claims that Yeltsin was probably drunk when he signed the Budapest Memorandum and the Helsinki Accords. But he actually signed the same document as me on the 28th of May 2002, which recognized the sovereign borders of the countries there. That was Vladimir Putin with the same signature on the same sheet as me. And he stood beside me and said, Ukraine is a sovereign, independent nation state, and it will make its own decisions about security. So, these false narratives, I think, need to get no real currency at all. Ambassador Simona was asking China. Well, China must be deeply uncomfortable at the present moment. They don't believe in breakaway provinces for a start. They've never recognized the annexation of Crimea. It's quite interesting, and most people haven't noticed that. They don't recognize Abkhazia, South Ossetia, or Transnistria, because they don't believe in breakaway provinces. That's their view about Taiwan. And if they want to have an argument with the United States of America, they'll want to have it on Chinese terms and not on Vladimir Putin's terms as well. So there is discomfort. They don't want Russia to lose. They don't necessarily want Russia to win at the moment. There's a degree of ambiguity. And of course, China and Russia are both meddling in the Western Balkans, as she says. And we're not paying sufficient attention to that. We need to have much more diplomatic attention paid, especially now that we're out of the European Union and not confined by the European Union rules on unanimity. We can then get involved in the Western Balkans as a unilateral move, and we should, because if the Chinese and the Russians are using the Western Balkans as a sort of adventure playground, then it's got profound implications for the rest of Europe as a whole. Lord Trenchard asked about who's going to pay for the recovery of Ukraine. Well, actually, the private sector will have a lot to do with that. The Ukrainians have shown a remarkable degree of ingenuity and inventiveness and entrepreneurial skill, and there's no doubt whatsoever that in the post-conflict situation they will want to help with their own recovery, and many other people will want the investment opportunities that will come along with that as well. John Speller asks about the reconstitution of our industrial base. Well, Vladimir Putin has declared war on the West, but you can't tell it here. There's no war economy going on in this country. We've still got, in defence terms, the fascination with platforms rather than with the ammunition and the missiles that go along with it. That's why we're running out of ammunition and missiles to give them, because we've given away practically all we've got. When we gave 13 Challenger tanks, I would have given them all. But anyway, I asked a former senior military commander why only 13, and he said, we've given them all the ones that work. I don't know whether he was joking or not, you know. But we need to have the same degree of diligence and force that the Russians have at the moment. Their missile factories are working round the clock to reconstitute what they've lost at the same time. So getting that same degree of urgency into this situation is all important. And the point I made last night at the London Defence Conference dinner was that the Prime Minister gave a morning this week to speak at the London Defence Conference, but he hasn't opened a single debate in the House of Commons about Ukraine. So we're at war, we're supplying people who are fighting on our behalf in another part of the European continent, and we haven't had a debate in the House of Commons opened by the Prime Minister. Contrast that with what Winston Churchill did during the Second World War. Virtually every week he briefed the House of Commons and had serious debates, allowing all these issues to be aired and ventilated. And if we are going to actually help the Ukrainians to win, we've got to keep public opinion in this country as mobilized as it is in Ukraine itself.
Brilliant. Thank you to our guests. We've been a masterclass. Please join me in expressing support, appreciation. Thank you.